the life assessments and how important they can be to your organization. One of the things that I like to point out quickly is that there's a lot of organizations and industries out there that already really take advantage of a day in the life assessment. And really, I guess if we define it, a day in the life assessment, it's going to be, if you're familiar with assessment centers, a day in the life assessment is an assessment center. These were started back during World War II, and this is how the British and the Germans and the U.S. decided who were going to be their next spies, who were going to be the next great spies. You've probably seen it all in the movie where they test these people, they put them through training, then they put them in real life scenarios because they want to see how are they going to perform. And obviously, too, in an assessment center and in a day in the life assessment exercise, you want to see that happen, but with maybe just a little pressure, because that's really where you're going to see how people are going to perform. So, you know, the obvious examples I can give you are, you know, pilots, they use flight simulators. They want to see if they can land the plane in a simulation environment before they put them in the real action. The NFL uses it every year at their rookie combine. You know, you can watch tape, you can see how they do, but how are they going to do in specific situations that you can put them in? And then obviously too with like movie directors, you know, they make the actors go through the scene and the role to see, hey, are they right for the organization? Are they showing the right emotion? So we're going to be talking about that today as we get kicked off here, and I'll make some introductions real quick. My name is Andy Crawford. I'm with Pensight, and once again, I really appreciate everybody joining today. We also have on the line with us Dr. Christy Panico, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Andy. At Pensight, I'm our Talent Solutions Manager, so I oversee a lot of our research and development initiatives as well as some of our partner relations. My background, or my training is in industrial organizational psychology, and I've spent quite a bit of time, the majority of my career in the talent assessment space. So not necessarily specifically in day in the life assessments, though I've been in this space for a number of years as well, but I've had a wide variety of experience with really all different types of talent assessments.
Well, and Chrissy, don't sell yourself short. If she is a subject matter expert when it comes to day in the life assessments. So as we're progressing today through the webinar, please feel free to, you can use the chat box to ask questions, or there's actually a question box. You can click on that. Ask questions as we go along, because Christy's got a very deep and thorough knowledge, not only from helping design day in the life assessments, but also working with the assessors who, you know, grade and view these assessments. So it's a great opportunity today to have Christy on the phone with us. And with that in mind, we'll quickly, well, you're welcome. You're welcome. We'll quickly hit the agenda so you know what we've got in front of us here. But we really want to cover three areas. Really, once again, what day in the life assessments are and how they're different from other assessments that are out there. What's the ROI of the day in the life assessment in leadership development and succession planning? How is this going to impact your business, and how is it going to save you money and put you ahead of your competitors? And finally, what are the factors to consider when implementing day in the life assessments in organizations? So there's some key things organizationally that you're going to want to make sure that it not only is right for your culture, but the proper expectations being set. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Christy and have her walk us through day in the life assessments.
Thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
So I'd like to start with looking at some statistics in terms of the use of day in the life assessments. So I was actually speaking with a client just the other day that we were talking about the assessment center method. Like Andy mentioned, day in the life assessments are really the assessment center method. And this client mentioned, you know, I thought those were done. I thought people were done doing them because they were so expensive. And that's a common thought. So we'll go through some of the history here in a minute, but generally speaking, assessment centers, though they've had a long history, they did kind of hit a lull because they were very costly and time-intensive solutions. And now with technology, we've seen a huge rise, kind of an assessment center renaissance, wherein we're seeing a revival of this method. In fact, we've seen that 84% of organizations are using assessment centers now for both selection decisions as well as purely developmental centers, which are for just developmental purposes alone. So this really is the future of talent assessment. We've seen a huge rise in the use lately, and I think with technology enabling us to do more and more with day-in-the-life assessments, we're not going to see this method going anywhere in the near future. And that's really the focus of our webinar today. So we're planning to first explain what are day-in-the-life assessments, secondly, how do these compare to other options, and then thirdly, how can you get your organization ready? And part of that involves being able to make the business case, so we'll touch on the ROI for day-in-the-life assessments as well. So to start with a little bit of history, and Andy alluded to some of this, the first attempt or the first use of really day-in-the-life assessments was the Office of Strategic Services, as Andy mentioned. And when I used to tell my students about this, the undergraduate students, they always appreciated hearing about the liquor test. So essentially what the Office of Strategic Service was doing was taking a bunch of candidates for potential espionage positions, and they wanted to put them in situations that they would actually experience in the field. So working with foreign diplomats, they knew that alcohol was commonly going to be involved in this, so they would put them through one of the tests, or one of the exercises at that point was what they called the liquor test, where they would essentially get the candidates drunk and see if then they could reveal their true identity. After that, it started becoming much more commonly used in talent management decisions and by organizations. So in about the 70s, we saw that the paper and pencil version, the traditional assessment centers, really took off. Here it was paper and pencil based, which of course was realistic at that time. The observers would follow people around with clipboards and really note what that person did, taking detailed notes as much as they could of what the people were doing or what they were saying, how they were interacting. And of course the reports were pretty static at that point. In the 90s, when technology started booming and we started having more options for recording role plays and recording interactions, we saw technology enhance assessment centers. So this is when we started using video cameras to record interactions, or maybe even telephones to do role play interactions. And this was really helpful because with the telephone, now the assessors or the individuals that are kind of confederates in that situation interacting with the candidate, they could now read a script. Whereas when they were interacting face-to-face, they would either have to memorize that and they wouldn't be able to have that directly in front of them. So this allowed for not only being able to observe the situation more holistically and really count everything with that video camera, but it also allowed for more engaging role plays as well. At that time, the reports, again, were still static. If other assessment tools were used, say, for example, a personality assessment, all of this was, of course, manually integrated, and we still had pretty lengthy written reports at that time. And now we're at the point where we have day-in-the-life assessments. So these are completely virtual assessment center solutions, and technology really enables us to make the most of this and to make this, really to make any idea a reality at this point. So by coupling that technology with the human input that we still traditionally had in the traditional approach, we can really maximize the experience for participants as well as the predictive ability of that assessment center. So we'll talk a little bit more now about what does day-in-the-life assessment centers involve. So as I mentioned, it really does maximize the use of technology, and there's a number of components that are really maximized by the use of technology, but there's three that I'm going to focus on here. The first one is replacing human observation. So we know that humans have a limited number of things that they can process at a time, a limited number of things that they can write down, and we just can't capture everything. But with technology, we truly can. We can capture things that are impossible for humans to really know. So not only can we look at everything that that person said and record everything verbatim of what they've said or done, but we can also look at things such as how long does someone spend looking at a document? Or how often do they open an email before they end up responding to it? Or how frequently do they switch tasks? Do they go from looking at an email to a completely unrelated document back to that email? And we know from the expert literature and the decision-making literature that these things matter, that these what we call micro actions that we can now capture with the technology are important. They're important for the performance in the assessment center, and they're important for predicting that individual leader's ability to succeed. Likewise, whereas before we had to really limit the number of competencies we were assessing, again, because humans are only able to observe and note so many things at one time, now we're able to really expand the number of competencies that we can assess, because recording that observation is not an issue any longer. With the technology, we have unlimited capability to record information, so really now it's just a matter of how much of that information is applicable. And we found that there's a lot more competencies now than we traditionally assessed that are applicable for assessing the leader's performance. And then finally is the big data algorithms, and this is probably the biggest part that's really revolutionizing the day in the life assessments. And this is really the idea that computers can crunch data in a way that humans will never be able to do. So Philip Tetlock is a well-known researcher in the field of expert predictions, and his research has suggested for many years that even basic, simple mathematical algorithms can outperform experts the majority of the time in terms of making predictions for the future and the accuracy of these predictions. So now with big data algorithms, we're able to combine all sorts of data before that wouldn't have been possible for us to even examine, let alone utilize in an effective way. So these algorithms are allowing us to really incorporate a massive amount of data to be able to better predict who's going to be the next leader, or who's going to be effective as the next leader or successor for our critical leadership position. So day in the life assessments still have a lot of overlaps with the traditional assessment center approach, and that the primary thing that still is true of day in the life assessments is what we call different exercises. So the idea behind the assessment center or day in the life approach is that we immerse participants in a fictitious company and in a fictitious leadership role, and we want it to seem like a fluid day in the life at work for them. But on the back end, really, we've intentionally created different exercises. And these exercises are designed to provide various opportunities to display a number of different competencies. And the important component here is that we're assessing competencies across situations. So it's never a single snapshot. And this is really important. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen a candidate perform very well in one particular exercise, and the same behavior perform very weak in a different exercise. We know that context matters, that someone might be able to deliver a great project plan, but can they actually present that in live format to their boss? So the ability to see how an individual performs across exercises within the same competency and across different competencies is a huge component of what makes assessment centers as effective as they are. So now I'll turn to show you a few examples of what this can look like for participants. So this comes from our participant platform, and our simulations or our virtual day in the life assessments are 3 hours in length, and we have a participant platform in which that is the virtual world for the participant. That is their fictitious company. That's where they have all the information they need to be making decisions and to be responding to requests and whatnot. So in this platform, they have an email inbox, and very typical of today's work environment, they'll receive some emails during the course of their day, and they'll have competing demands within these emails. There'll be multiple different things that are coming at once, and they'll be tasked really with managing both their time as well as how they manage their priorities in that environment. They also have a calendar feature. So the calendar feature lets them know not only when their meetings are going to come, so there's what we call live video role plays that occur during that day in the life assessment, and they're always told when those role plays are going to come or when those meetings will be happening, what the context of the meeting is, if there's anything they need to do to prepare, any information that they should have before the meeting. And then, of course, they have this calendar feature that lets them know when those meetings are coming so that they can manage their time more appropriately. When it's time for their meeting, they'll receive an incoming call in the same platform, and they'll have the ability to answer that call, and then they'll jump right into kind of a virtual face-to-face environment where they're able to see the other individual that they're interacting with. They're able to see themselves. And again, this is all still within this virtual world. So they're not going to external systems or software, and that really helps with the realistic nature of the day in the life assessment. So now we'll turn to explaining a little bit more about how day in the life assessments compared to other tools. So there's just a few criteria that I've listed here, and there's of course many more to consider, but for the sake of brevity, I'll focus on some of the more important components. So the first is we'll be comparing personality tests, situational judgment tests, and interviews. So personality tests, I assume most people are familiar with. Situational judgment tests, in case you're not familiar, these are assessments that essentially provide a participant with a hypothetical situation and ask them, would you do A, B, C, or D? And A, B, C, or D are different actions that they could take in that scenario. And then interviews, I'm assuming most people are familiar with the notion of interviews as well. So the first decision, or the first criteria, is can we use this in hiring, promotion, and development situations? Now, of course, there's variability across different tools, but generally speaking, situational judgment tests are developed and validated for use in all of those situations. Typically, interviews are also used in all those situations, and day-in-the-life assessments are also developed and validated for use in all of those situations. Personality test is really the only one where there's some variability. Most can be used in all of those situations, but it really depends on the specific tool that you're using. Some are not meant to be used in hiring, some are not really intended to be used in development. The second criteria, and probably the most important, is the ability to actually predict performance. So this is essentially the validity of the tool. In personality tests, this tends to be fairly low for the ability to actually predict performance, and that makes sense because we're making an inference there. We're saying if this is your personality, you're likely to behave in this way, therefore we can predict you're going to react or perform in this particular way. So there's a number of inferences there that may or may not always hold true. Situational judgment tests, the validity tends to be a little bit higher because we are asking about specific situations. However, it's not as high as it could be because, one, we're imposing those responses. So when you get A, B, C, or D, maybe you wouldn't do any of them. Maybe you would do E or a combination of A and C, and that's not really captured with situational judgment tests. Likewise, because we're asking people hypothetically, what would you do? We don't know if that's actually what they would do in that situation or if that's what they think they should do in that situation. Interviews can be low to moderate depending on how structured they are and what the setup is of the interview. Structured behavioral interviews tend to have moderate to high validity, whereas unstructured or non-behavioral interviews tend to have pretty low validity. And then day-in-the-life assessments tend to have the highest validity. The assessment center approach has traditionally always had the highest validity out of different types of assessment tools that we use, and the day-in-the-life assessments are really no exception to that. The next one, open-ended, this is, and I kind of alluded to this before with the situational judgment test, but this is an important consideration because it's essentially asking, are we imposing responses on people or are we allowing them to freely respond? So open-ended is such as in interviews or day-in-the-life assessments where there's no response options. You are free to answer however you wish. And it's kind of up to you how you respond in those situations. Whereas multiple choice assessments are by their very nature closed-ended. They're not, we are imposing responses. No matter how good a test developer you are, you cannot compile every single thing that people will do. So you come up with, okay, what are the 4 most common options here? And then people are forced to choose between them. And again, that may or may not be reflective of how they truly feel or how they would truly behave in that situation. The next criteria is eliminates bias. So this can be a number of different biases that are involved. This can be rater biases. This can be biases in terms of how the decisions are made. This can be self-biases. And that's why I put some for personality tests. So while it does eliminate the biases of others to a large degree, depending on how that information is used, it certainly doesn't eliminate self-biases. So how you report yourself is really only as good as your awareness of yourself and how honest you're being with the report of yourself. Situational judgment tests tend to eliminate biases, again, depending on how that information is used. Interviews, we know, are very prone to biases. So interviewer biases come into play quite frequently in the interview process, particularly if they're not structured, if they're not behavioral, and if there's not kind of a scoring rubric for how those interviews are going to be evaluated. And then day in the life assessments truly do eliminate quite a few biases. So not only are we eliminating some of those biases that we commonly see in terms of self-biases, because that individual is really immersed in that situation and it's a challenging situation, so we're ideally seeing the full representation of that person. But we're also eliminating some of the organizational biases that might come into play. So for example, when we think about 360s, we know there's so much politics involved in that. With day in the life assessments, typically the raters are third-party objective individuals that are highly trained to be in that role. So we're eliminating biases as really as much as you can, given that humans are involved in the process and there's always bias involved with humans. And then finally is the cost. Sure.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to throw in there real quickly, because this question I get quite often, and it has to do with people gaming the system or cheating, for just being quite blatant and honest with it. You know, one of the conversations we have quite a bit is, well, can't people game a day in the life? You know, and if we look at it in comparison to the other ones, in a personality test, in a situational judgment, and even in an interview, one thing we have to consider, and companies should consider, whether it's for hiring, high potential identification, succession planning, is people want to win. People want that next position. They want the position because to them it represents, you know, it's a gain in their life. It's an achievement. It's the next step. Oftentimes it means more money. So in many cases, and I'll ask everybody, let's see a show of hands. Who thinks you can game a personality questionnaire? It looks like all the hands are up there. Thank you. Yeah, because people were going to try to answer it saying, okay, not necessarily how would I answer it, but what's the answer that's going to get me to the next level? So that's one of the important factors to consider. And when you look at it with regard to the day in the life, people say, well, Andy, people can game a day in the life. They can tell you what you want to hear. But what they're demonstrating, yeah, they can. But what they're demonstrating is that they know the answer. And if they're gaming you or trying to play the game and give you the answer you want, well, they're giving it to you live. So you know they can do it. Whereas within testing, you can make up a lot of things and say you can do things, but will you really do them when push comes to shove? So once again, just wanted to throw that in because that's one of the common questions that I get quite often.
Yeah, that is a great question. That was a question I used to get quite a bit when I was serving as an external consultant with talent assessments is, can the participant cheat? How do I know if they're being honest? And in a lot of cases, you don't know. But with the day in the life, as Andy mentioned, because we're actually putting them in that situation, if they don't have the skills, they can't do it. If they have the skills, they'll be able to do it. Does that mean they'll always display those skills? Maybe, maybe not. But oftentimes that comes out through the different exercises that I referenced earlier. So the last criteria here is the cost. And of course, this is an important consideration as well. Personality tests, situational judgment tests tend to be fairly low in terms of cost. Interviews are commonly thought of as a low-cost solution, but when you actually think about the time that goes into developing a solid interview, the interview questions and the scoring rubric, as well as the time of the interviewers, depending on how many people are being interviewed, the cost can actually, they can get high pretty quickly with the interviewer's time involved. And then finally, day in the life assessments, and the cost here is still high relative to other tools, much lower compared to the traditional assessment center, and we'll get at that in one moment. But the cost relative to personality tests, situational judgment tests, is a lot higher. So with that, we'll move into the next part of the presentation, which is really looking at the ROI. Because if we look at the cost alone, that's not giving us a complete picture of what the assessment tools are doing actually for our business case and the bottom line. So this first ROI analysis comes from one of our longtime clients and some of the work we've done with them, Denver Public Schools. And in this case, we're comparing this to doing nothing. So in this case, they had what we would consider kind of a control group, a group of leaders that did not receive the day in the life assessment, and a group of, a pretty large group of leaders that did receive that day in the life assessment. So with the leaders that they did receive this, they invested about $150,000, which of course in the do nothing group they didn't have any investment. However, what they noted was that the individuals that completed the day in life assessment they noted increased engagement, but with that increased retention of those leaders. So they actually had 13% decrease in turnover with the group that had used the day in the life assessment, which resulted in an ROI for them calculating turnover as 100% of the annual salary, which is by some a very conservative calculation of turnover costs. They had an ROI of just over or close to 1,900%. Now we'll turn to look at personality tests and the ROI as compared to there. So in this scenario, we're assuming we have 20 leaders that need to be developed, and we're assuming an annual salary of about $88,000. That's how some of these figures are derived. And then the increase in productivity is based on the validity coefficients, or the average validity coefficient for personality tests as compared to assessment centers. So typically with personality tests, we can expect to see at best a 9% increase in productivity. And again, this is typically because personality tests are increasing awareness. Whereas with assessment centers, we're actually seeing that it's improving the actual skills. So we see a much higher increase in productivity. So despite the higher investment initially of the assessment center as compared to the personality test, again, we're seeing that greater ROI. So in this particular scenario, an ROI of about 341%. Now we'll look at 360-degree feedback and performance reviews. This is a commonly used tool or method in succession planning and leadership development. Again, 360's performance reviews, it's one of those that we see it as a low-cost solution, but when we actually calculate the time it takes for people to make their ratings, to train people to make ratings accurately, and then if we use the software to compile those ratings, the costs can actually add up pretty quickly. But even still, assuming we're paying $250 per employee, research suggests that about 50% of newly promoted leaders succeed, so 50% fail in this situation as well. Whereas with an assessment center, this is based on some of the data we've collected with a different client of ours. We found that 80% of newly promoted leaders succeed when they're selected based on the day in the life assessment or the assessment center approach. So again, despite the higher investment, we're seeing an ROI here of about 870%. And then finally is the comparison to traditional assessment centers. So commonly, traditional assessment centers are about $10,000 per employee once you take into account the cost of the assessment center, the cost of travel, time lost due to travel and being at the assessment center. Whereas with the virtual assessment center approach, obviously we don't have any of those travel costs. The time involved is significantly less, and then the actual cost of the assessment center is also significantly less. And we're assuming here that they're both equally valid, that they're both resulting in the same increase in productivity. And so this is rather conservative because our research actually suggests that at least our virtual assessment centers are demonstrating slightly higher validity than is typically reported for the traditional assessment centers. Even assuming the conservative estimate that they are the same, we're still seeing an ROI of 3,900%. So quite an ROI when compared to the traditional assessment center approach. And that really, of course, is the impetus behind the new day in the life assessment center method, is maintaining the ability to predict who's going to be our next successor, who the high potential employees are, while reducing that cost, thereby increasing the ROI. So finally, we'll conclude with a couple factors to consider when implementing day in the life assessments. And many of these, I would say, are true of other assessments. It just looks a little bit differently with day in the life assessment. So first is selling the need internally. And again, this is true of any tool. However, unlike most of the common low-cost tools, this is going to be a bit more of a complex sale. So you're selling a higher-end solution that also comes with higher return, but that higher price tag. So you really have to be able to make the business case. And that's one of the reasons that we've presented some of the ROI statistics to be able to help you make that business case when selling it internally. The second is being selective. So with a lot of assessment tools, they're what we consider select out tools, meaning that we start with a large pool of people and our goal is really to narrow that pool down. But with the higher end solutions, such as day in the life assessments, it's actually more of a what do we call a select in tool. So we really want to start with a much smaller pool of people, and we want to be selective in who that pool is. Because we're investing greater resources into those individuals. And then we use the tool to select in who are the individuals that are going to be, for example, part of our high potential development program or going to be groomed as successors or whatever it may be. The third one is to start with a pilot. So again, I would recommend this with any assessment tool, but it's particularly true with a higher end assessment tool such as this, because we really need to be able to determine it works before we roll this out on a broader scale. So typically starting with a few people, determining what works, what didn't, and being able to make modifications so that when it does get rolled out on a larger scale, we can ensure it's smooth and successful. And then finally, the last one is not a once and done activity. So this is also true for many assessment solutions. However, it's not so easy to make other tools an ongoing development tool. But with day in the life assessments, this capability is much greater because the feedback is so specific, because it is behavioral, because there is context-specific feedback that can be offered. So rather than offering, for example, a personality test, if we tell someone they're not a very caring person, that's not very helpful feedback for them. But instead, if we tell them, the data suggests that you're really good at mentoring and coaching when you're working one-on-one with your direct reports, but when you're trying to manage coworker conflict, you don't have the same degree of mentor and coaching skills, or at least you're not showing that to the same degree. That's much more behavioral and specific feedback that people can actually then use to inform their development and really make it an ongoing developmental process. So with that, I'd like to open it up and see what questions have come in. Andy, are there any questions that we have at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. This one, they're asking specifically about our tool, and if we can add what other day in the life assessments do, but they specifically want to know how, since you're measuring skills and performance, how do you compare employees against one another? It says, you mentioned high potential identification and succession planning, but how do you compare employees once they've completed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the great things about the assessment center approach is that though it's complex and it's really a full day in the life assessment, on the back end, it's set up so that we're measuring different exercises, we're measuring different skills, and everyone's receiving those same stimuli. So everyone's getting the same emails, everyone's having the same role play more or less. So the actors, for example, are heavily scripted so that they're really standardizing that experience across participants so that comparisons can be made among different candidates or employees.
Okay. Their follow-up question on that is, I'm just letting them finish typing up here. Oh, okay. How do you keep the scoring consistent? Because once again, with a lot of them, you've got the human element involved with the scoring, with the role playing and participation. So how is that kept consistent?
That's a really good question. So there's a couple of things we do to keep that consistent. The first one is hiring individuals that are trained and that have experience doing this. So we hire individuals for our assessor roles, particularly individuals with an industrial organizational psychology background, because that training involves quite a bit of behavioral observation and rating, combating rating errors. So that background in and of itself lends itself nicely. And then we take an approach where we also train our assessors. They go through a very lengthy process of onboarding and training, wherein we do what we call frame of reference training and train on a number of different biases that need to be combated. We also take a number of steps to what we call calibrate rating. So for example, all of our assessors will rate the same person, and then we'll talk about why some ratings are different than others and what ratings are considered correct in that instance. And we actually do that every 6 months with our assessors to ensure that everyone is standardized and everyone's rating the same. And then additionally, we use multiple raters. So it's not just one person looking at a participant. We have multiple people that are viewing that participant's responses and what they did. And because they are calibrated and standardized, we know that they're rating similarly across participants, and then as well as across exercises within the same participant.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, how do you account for cultural differences that may occur as companies expand globally?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. We do quite a bit of international work. For example, our day in the life assessments are translated into about 7 different languages, I believe, at this point, possibly 8. And to account for some of those cultural differences, we also employed local assessors. So for example, we have a team of assessors in Belgium. If the candidate is located in that area, those assessors will be conducting the role plays with them. They'll also be making the ratings so that they can take into account kind of the cultural nuances of that local region. And that's one way that we account for it. The second way is that when we set up the simulation and we set up the competencies that we're measuring, we really sought to measure competencies that are considered globally important. So regardless of what country you're from or what culture you're from, we've set out to really examine, and we have used research to support this, what we call global leadership competencies that would be important for any leader, regardless of where they're operating.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question coming in, they're wanting to know, they're assuming, they say, I'm assuming that there are competencies behind the scoring in a day in the life assessment. So with that in mind, if a company already has a competency framework in place, can those be adopted into the day in the life?
Yep, that is a good question. There are definitely competencies behind, so that's part of how we standardize the experience and ensure that the ratings are really representative of that individual. We're using standardized scales, and everyone's, you know, evaluated on those same standardized scales. So in terms of modifying those competencies, we do have the capability of what we call configure. So assuming that our competencies are conceptually similar to the organization's competencies, it's a very easy process to go in and kind of change the labels used. If they're completely different competencies, what we found is, so we've mapped on our competencies to a lot of the most popular competency frameworks, and there's a pretty good one-to-one match on most of them. So in our experience, we haven't come across many competency frameworks that really don't fit with ours. We've found a pretty good match for most of the competencies that we've come across. But if they are completely different, then that's when we would, depending on the degree of difference, that's when we might look into something like customization, because we do set up the scenarios to measure certain competencies. So if we start changing those competencies significantly, then we also need to change those scenarios to make sure that we're giving the leaders an opportunity to display the competencies that we're looking for.
Okay, great. And they had a follow-up on here. They state that they utilize the simplified 38 by Korn Ferry. Is this something that could be configured in to the framework?
It is, yeah. We have mapped on some of Korn Ferry's competencies with the competencies we're currently using, and we worked with a number of clients that have used that competency framework with great success. So that is something that's certainly possible.
Fantastic. Next question is, they've been reading where GE, Adobe, and other companies are dropping performance reviews in favor of assessments. They didn't, it says in the article, they didn't specifically state it was an assessment center, but they've heard that it is an assessment center. How would you do that? How do you replace a performance review with a day in the life assessment?
Yeah, many of our clients have actually done just that and had great success in doing so. So the issue, of course, with performance reviews, why people are moving away from them, is that they're not considered very accurate, that there's so much biasy and rating error involved in that process that it's not really resulting in accurate data, which of course is not going to be very helpful for us when we go to make a decision. So rather than using that performance appraisal approach, replacing that with an annual assessment program wherein key leaders and key successors go through an assessment center approach or perhaps some other type of assessment depending on their level, and that actually replaces that input of data. So essentially performance appraisals are all about gaining data so that we can determine, make decisions about talent management and also help our employees develop. But that's not the only source of data, certainly, and the research really suggests that there's more valid sources of data, such as the day in the life assessments, to be able to inform those decisions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Anybody have one more question for us before we sign off for today? Christy, anything you'd like to add?
I don't think there's a whole lot to add on my end other than kind of what we talked about at first in terms of being ready for this. So of course, I'm biased. I work for a day in the life assessment company, but as I've mentioned before, I work for a day in the life assessment company because I believe in the method and not vice versa. So I really see with the capability of technology and the amount of data that we can now collect with technology, data that was previously, just a figment of our imagination, we can now actually use to make talent management decisions. I really see this as the wave of the future and where organizations are really moving in terms of making talent management decisions. So if it's not something that you're currently considering, I would really urge you to at least give it some thought now, because I think as we go forward in this war for talent that it's going to be a key component to being successful in that war.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Christy, thank you very much. We appreciate getting you on the phone and talking about day in the life assessments today. We'll be sending out a link of the webinar, so if anybody out there wants to share this with colleagues, please feel free to forward that out. Also, if you have any additional questions, there is our contact information. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Everybody have a great rest of the week. Enjoy the remaining days of July, and hopefully we'll talk to everybody very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.